Trump needed more Democratic support. And he knew he wasn't going to get that support. So the way to fix this was that if you made the tax bill budget neutral, you didn't have to get the same level.
You could pass it through reconciliation.
You could pass it through reconciliation. Mm-hmm. So basically the way to fix this was they just said, okay, we're going to make the tax changes, but we're going to say that in 2026, they expire. We just revert to the old tax code. Mm-hmm. So things that changed, we have lower tax brackets. We have bigger standard deductions. We have a qualified business income deduction for business owners.
My personal favorite is the doubling of the child tax credit.
So there's all of these things. Now, this didn't impact people equally. One thing that was really different.
Welcome to the Money Alchemist podcast. I'm your host, Ben Jones.
And I'm Brent Gargano.
Thanks for being here today. Brent, how was your weekend?
It was great. It was great. We spent some time. Weather has been awesome. After a month and a half of snow and rain and clouds, we finally had, at least 3 or 4 days now of sunshine. So actually got out and did some things outside for the
weather was as unexpectedly surprising for the season as the recent jobs report on Friday.
I guess that's a fair way to characterize it. I think it was almost 60 degrees yesterday.
Yeah. So it was nice. Yeah, we got some outside time in. I actually took a walk for the first time in what feels like ages. Took my son over to a neighbor's house and did some IT work for a neighbor in need. So when you are somewhat competent at computers, it's funny. Like everybody calls you for IT assistance because they don't know who else to call because Microsoft doesn't have a 1-800 number. So you end up being the go-to guy for everything. By the way, for anybody listening, I don't know anything about computers. So if you have an issue, don't call me. So it was overall a very good weekend, good weather. Hope everybody listening also had a great weekend. Well, we've got an interesting topic today, kind of a hot, what would you say, contentious topic, and we get it all the time. How many client calls do you take every week where, the client is wondering, Brent, should I be in or out of the markets because so-and-so is going to be president, or the election is not swinging the way that I think it should go? How often are you fielding that question? I feel like I am a lot.
Yeah, I think it's everybody likes to have opinions and they seem to like their opinions. And so whether it's one opinion or the other, I think one of the hard things in being an advisor is the market at the end of the day doesn't necessarily care about your politics. And so when you've got clients that are calling you that have valid or concerns that may be concerns in the political scheme or in the broader population, it doesn't necessarily always mean that those concerns translate into their investment accounts. And so it's one of the more, I'll say, contentious investment topics.
Oh, yeah.
I think.
We're going to have a lot of fun today. So interesting things to consider that a lot of people may not realize is that the stock market does not care who the president is. They literally don't care. In fact, when looking at the data, the best performance according to, what's this data here? Let me see where the source is out at. Looks like it's coming from Bloomberg and Gallup. The best performance in the S&P 500 occurs when there is a mixed or divided government. Yeah. So when
less can actually happen.
Correct. Yeah. So markets actually prefer there to not be a political alignment. They like there to be political tension. But I wanted, before we dive into all that, the one thing that I wanted to start this conversation out with is to bring up the Gallup poll for what are the top issues on the minds of voters today. On the economic front, the economy in general is one. Second is the high cost of living / inflation. That's obviously been all over the news. Third one, which is all the rage in the finance space and FinTwit, as they call it, is the federal budget deficit. That's like half of the tweets that I read anymore are about the federal budget. We'll talk about that, go over some interesting statistics. And on the non-economic side, we have government, poor leadership. Has that ever been different? I mean, honestly. And then they're unifying the country. I feel I've been voting since what was it? Obama, and who was he facing first? It was
McCain,
not McCain, Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
So that was the first election that I was engaged in. In reality, my dad sent me a mail-in voting ballot when I was in college for the Bush-Gore election, and he mailed it to me. Said, "Ben, did you vote?" And I said, "Yes, I didn't. Sorry, Dad." I just didn't care. I didn't mail it in. Anyway, but ever since that election, that first election I was engaged in, it's all been about unity, bringing the country together. And I just don't think to me, it just sounds like it's not possible because we're just too diverse. We have too many different opinions, too many different backgrounds, cultures. So this whole notion that we can unify the country, I've always found dubious. And then the third non-economic concern amongst voters right now is just democracy. I'm not sure what that means. I guess they're afraid that democracy is compromised.
Is that the Trump effect?
I guess it must be. What's ironic is we do not live in a democracy. It bothers me that everybody's like, the democracy is threatened. It's like, well, we don't have a democracy. We have a constitutional republic. It's a big difference. A direct democracy would mean that all of our votes actually do go directly to the candidate, but that's not how it works.
Because of the Electoral College.
Correct. Yeah. So for folks that say that our democracy is under threat, it's like, well, maybe you should learn a little bit more about how elections work, because technically, the democracy was under threat when the Constitution was written.
Well, I think there are a number of people that would argue the case for or against popular votes versus the Electoral College.
Well, the spirit of governance is democracy. I think that's what they're getting at. Is sure. Like, our governance is, election by the people through the people. So I totally get that. But let's hit these economic concerns on the head, like the economy in general. There is a lot of talk right now that we're imminently going into a recession. And I just don't see the evidence of that anecdotally. Yes, I see the data, the macro data, the Fed tightening, the quantitative tightening, processes that they're engaging in. I also see, certain, retail sales slowing down, wage inflation slowing down. There is evidence that, a recession could happen, but isn't it a guarantee the recession is eventually going to happen?
Yeah. And historically speaking, they used to be much more frequent. Mm-hmm. And I was reading, 100 years ago, recessions happened every couple of years. And in recent history, we've honestly averaged more like 8 to 10 years in between a recession. This last one in the middle of COVID was actually 12 years from the prior recession and the financial crisis. So to have one so soon after our last recession, now, maybe we could argue the two have some related elements to them, but it would be somewhat uncharacteristic of recent history. Now, on the other side of that, you haven't, at least in measurable history, we haven't had. So right now, the bond yield curve is what's called inverted. So you get paid more to own a bond that is shorter term than you do for a longer term bond. So right now, for like, if you had money and you could put it in a 2-year bond, you might get paid 4.5%, 5%, whereas in a 10-year bond, you might get paid 4%. That's not normal. Normally, you get paid more interest to be locked into this bond for a longer period of time. So you'd see a 2-year bond yield 4 and a 10-year bond yield 5. Somehow we have to go from what's called an inverted yield curve, where we are now, to an uninverted yield curve, with that healthy yield curve that trends up and to the right that we were talking about. And in measured history, that has not happened without a coincident recession.
I read over the weekend that the U.S. Bond yield curve has been inverted for a record period of time. I think it was something like 308 days. Don't quote me on that. But it's definitely over 300 days. So something unique is happening with fixed income markets right now. And I don't necessarily think that it is signaling a recession. What it's signaling to me is that there's a lot of currency, a lot of cash, a lot of liquidity, especially on the balance sheets of financial institutions, and they just don't know where to park it. So they're just parking it in long duration bonds. Plus, you're seeing the Fed, when the Fed changes its target interest rate, they're really only doing it at the short end of the curve, because that's the only thing they can control, or essentially money markets. And so that's short-term rates. And then to compound that, most of the not most, but a good portion of the Treasury issuance has been in T-bills. So these are notes that are 12 months or younger, so or shorter. Sorry. So I think that you're just seeing a huge amount of supply come on the market for short-term interest rates or short-term notes, and the most of the demand, like what these major pension funds, which are huge consumers or purchasers of the long-term debt, because they need to control that. They need to control their outflows, their risk profile. So, they like the dependability of having something that's going to earn X amount of return for 10 years. But when you don't have a lot of 10-year issuance, it's going to drive the yields down because there's more buyers than there is supply. So I think there's a lot of chicanery going on that doesn't necessarily signal a recessionary. A recessionary. How do I say this? It's not signaling a recession. It's wonky supply and demand mechanics. You know what I'm saying? So I don't personally look at the inverted yield curve and look, oh man, that's a sign of a recession. And I think that we could see the yield curve pretty flat to inverted for a long period of time before any sort of recession. Now, don't get me wrong, a recession is going to happen. I don't believe it's going to be this year. Now, you cannot predict recessions. So nobody should take that as financial advice and get out of the markets just because, or get into the markets just because, Ben Jones doesn't say there's going to be a recession. There absolutely could be. You cannot predict these things. But right now, seeing what I'm seeing, looking at the data that I'm seeing, when I go to Costco on the weekends, when I go to First Watch, we went to just a local cafe yesterday for lunch, my family and I. And, there was a wait. The place was just packed at the gills. Families were coming and going. People were walking away. You do not see that kind of behavior when money is tight. As people say, well, it can happen suddenly. It's like, okay, yeah, well, I was around in 2009. I remember the recession, and that was a big, that was a big deal. And I remember the traffic being noticeably light, and thinking, man, I got into work real quick today. And that was before the market started falling apart. So I think that the consumer starts to pull back significantly before we see that reflected in the economic data, certainly, but also in financial markets as well, especially with how quickly information travels these days. So anyway, I'm not seeing a consumer that's pulling back. In fact, I'm seeing a pretty steady consumer. And I also am not too concerned about the yield curve signaling a recession. What I am concerned about, and this is also something on the minds of most voters today, is the U.S. fiscal situation. So let's talk about that, because I think that is definitely more interesting. And there's some sharp teeth on the data that we're looking at. So before I dig into that, do you have any comments on that?
Well, we've talked about it, in the past. I think there are a lot of reasons to believe the economy. There's a lot of data that supports that the economy is strong. The question is, what's going to happen in the future? I don't see a lot. I mean, between all of the people that are out there shopping for homes that have high amounts of home equity, markets at all-time highs, I don't see the right conditions to set up for, even if we had a recession, not like a severe recession. Now, that's not to say, I mean, they're always in investing, there's this belief that what's out there today is what's going to drive the stock market to go down. So if you asked me today, what do I think is going to happen with the stock market? I could list a lot of bad things that are going on with the stock market. Generally speaking, the next leg lower of the market isn't created by something that you know about today. It's something that you don't know about yet that you're going to find tomorrow. And so I think that you always have to, in personal finance in general, you always have to leave room for error. So I certainly wouldn't build a portfolio or hinge a financial plan on the notion that there's not going to be a recession this year, or that it's not going to be a deep recession. But I think from looking at the data that we're getting and looking at things like the average amount of home equity in the U.S. that we talked about last time,
yep.
It seems like it'd be hard to find a really deep recession outside of some out of left field thing that we're not talking about.
We're certainly not getting on the unemployment data. The economy in the fourth quarter last year grew by 3.3%. I see a lot of pundits say, well, that's because of government and healthcare jobs, or government and healthcare spending. It's like, well, that counts, So it's like saying, I don't know what it would be a good analogy. Like, it's like going to the grocery store and buying, let's go to Costco, because I spend money on Costco. So let's say my wife sends me to Costco and I come back and spend $300. And then my wife's like, well, you spent $300. Why'd you do that? And I'm like, yeah, but the the gadgets, the TV I got was only was 250 of that. It's like, well, you still spent $300. So it counts, all of it counts. So, U.S. economy fourth quarter accelerated a bit, grew by an annualized rate of 3.3%. And then, GDP growth last year was 2.5%. So definitely not recessionary. I don't see that turning around this year, and that segues into kind of our election forecast. I personally am not predicting any major changes in Washington. I know there's a lot of talk about it. We've got, everybody talking about Trump versus Biden right now. Candidly, I'm just a little exhausted from 2020 still. So I'm not super invested in either personality. But I think from an economic standpoint, it really doesn't matter. I know a lot of folks are probably disagree with me on that. But if you look at the data for, how the market has performed based on each president, actually the stock market under Trump and the stock market under Biden are remarkably similar when you look at the S&P 500 returns from the election day to about a little over their 700th day. Both are positive between like 30 and 40% on a cumulative performance scale here. This is data according to Haver and Invesco, of course, here. But going back even further, looking at different presidents, through most presidential cycles, since looks like JFK here, we've had positive performance in the S&P 500. Granted, you're looking at 4 to 8 year cycles. So most 4 to 8 year periods, U.S. markets are positive. So that doesn't surprise me at all. The presidents that had the highest amounts of volatility, again, this is data according to Haver and Invesco, are Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush. Coincidentally, all Republican presidents had the most volatile stock markets during their presidency.
You're talking George Bush Sr.?
No, yeah, Junior, George W. Bush. He presided during the great financial crisis.
He had one of the worst markets for his presidency.
For sure. He inherited the market at pretty close to an all-time high and then had the GFC. So and that's another thing about these presidents. They all inherit circumstances that they do not control. And so it's kind of silly to put all these presidents on equal footing and compare like, well, the stock market was great under Reagan and it was terrible under, I don't know who else you would say, Carter. It's like, well, they all inherited different starting periods and different ending periods. So they don't inherit the ending period.
And to further that, there are things that happen along the way that are outside of their control. So like, for example, I have an investing deck that I've presented in situations like investing basics. So I talk to my students about this, for example. If you look from the beginning of Trump's presidency, if you look at the energy sector, okay, so we're talking about oil and gas energy companies, and we're looking from the beginning of Trump's presidency in 2017 to the end of Trump's presidency in 2021. What do you think the performance of the broader energy index was over that time? Remember, this was the guy that said we want to unleash the power of American energy. Energy stocks.
Yeah, they were down
42%. Okay.
Let's see how that worked.
Now, flip the page over one more time. Now we have Biden in presidency.
Yeah.
Of course, we have a green energy deal, all of these other things to do away with the oil and gas sector. What do you think the performance has been of the energy sector since Biden's gotten in office?
It's over 200%.
It's up 150%.
Okay.
So you're a little optimistic. But, if I gave you, if you had a time machine and could go back to 2016 when Trump got into presidency, and I could say, would you rather buy energy stocks during Trump's presidency or, technology stocks? I think there were lots of people. I mean, I know for me, when I was working at Fidelity at the time, and the client questions that we got were related around people wanted to buy defense stocks and energy stocks, things that they thought Trump was going to put a lot of money into. And I'll take this one step further and say COVID was in the middle of Trump's presidency. Oil went negative. So again, it's some of these things are outside of the control of the president.
Yeah, a lot of things are. I personally don't think that the American electorate has a good understanding for what they should value or what they should think is so important during these election cycles. What I think is most relevant in this election cycle isn't who is going to be president. I think that culturally matters a lot. People tend to put a lot of emphasis on culture more so than economics. Do you agree with that? That's why, before this podcast, we're talking about the phenomenon that is Taylor Swift and how people are literally taking out credit card debt to pay for $1,000 tickets, and how that is just insane. Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you? This would be stupid to take out credit card debt to invest in the S&P 500, but I'd rather you do that. I'd rather you do that than go and buy. But that just goes to show you how much more important people think culture is than economics, which is, as a financial advisor, that drives me insane.
Well, people value short-term pleasure more than they dislike the idea of long-term pain.
Yeah.
And those two things, kind of being weighed out in our brain as we're trying to make spending decisions.
Yeah. And I guess what they when it comes to these elections and why people get so tied up into them, like emotionally, and to the point where if they are disappointed that their team did not win, that they are going to cash in all their chips and just not invest, which is crazy, because that means that you're probably going to miss out on a lot of economic progress as a result. Fortunately, and thank God for this, our economy is not dependent on one individual or even one individual and their administration. Our economy is so much larger than that. There's no single party that has, or individual that has unilateral control over our economics. But people, I think, tend not, and I'm generalizing grossly here. There's a lot of folks out there that tend to think that is the case, and they make investment decisions based on that, or they hold off on investment decisions because of that. And I think because they just get so culturally intertwined in their political affiliation, which is nothing more than like I shouldn't say nothing more. It probably is a little bit more than just a football team. Like we all cheer for the Bengals here in Cincinnati. I personally don't really care. I'm not much of a sports aficionado, but I get why people love sports and they get so emotionally engaged in it, even though it's like, why, where is the relationship? What does that do for you? And I think a lot of folks, they tend to get emotionally intertwined with their with political victories.
Well, I don't think that's fair, because I think that politics, more so than football. I mean, football is entertainment, and I think everybody likes, if their team it wins and whatnot. But the government they do have a direct impact on your life. I think culturally, people care a lot about the freedoms they feel that they have and the way that they're perceived in the society that they live. And so I think those things impact them on a day-to-day basis. I think there's good reason that people feel passionately about politics. But on the other side of that, no matter one way or another how you feel about politics, you still go buy your iPhone or there are some people that make spending decisions with politics in mind, but on the whole, we are a society of consumers.
Yeah.
And the political environment really to the market matters from the standpoint of how you feel you're going to change your consumption. And a lot of times, whether or not one person's in the presidency or not may impact how you feel about politics and how confident you feel in the economy. But the market only cares about to the extent that you're going to tighten your belt and stop spending money. Mm-hmm. And so that's the problem with right now is we have a lot of people that are saying, I'm upset about the inflation and I'm upset about whatever the XYZ thing that's going on today. But the truth is they're still spending money.
Yes. And I project they will continue to spend money. And if, in fact, their political party does not have a victory this November, they'll probably engage in retail therapy and spend it even more. That's my theory. I don't mean to suggest that politics and sports are on equal footing. I do agree with your statement that that politics do matter, but they matter much more culturally than they do economically. And freedom matters to me as well. I guess my point there is, freedoms have been trampled on and opened up under either political party. So it's just like, which flavor of freedom do you want? So I guess when it comes to the larger conversation of, okay, what political party should you vote for if you value freedom? It's like, well, neither and both. It's like, it depends. But I don't want to get into that because that is not my area of expertise, and that is it really doesn't matter when it comes to your investment thesis.
But let's talk about what's at stake here.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah. I ahead of time, I went ahead and put together some charts, and what we wanted this to demonstrate was the power of why you need to be invested through different market cycles and why it's important to stay invested. So we actually ran two scenarios. So I'll present them one at a time. So scenario one, we basically have, so I'm going to paint the picture here. It's 2007, right before the great financial crisis. You're 35 years old. You've managed to save $250,000 towards your future, retirement or whatever, and you're on track to continue to save $40,000 adjusted for inflation every year per year. So the question is, one, should I save that in cash, or two, should I invest it? So what I try to do with this is really lay out the dichotomy of that decision. On one hand, you have somebody that's got all of that money saved, and all of the money that they're bringing in, they're continuing to save it as cash. Person two is taking all of that money they're saving and putting it all in the stock market. And because of the future, we happen to now know what was the future. We know that starting in 2007, you were getting ready to go into the great financial crisis of 2008. So let's talk about what happened with those two people. So the person sitting in cash in 2009 has managed to save $370,000+ of cash. The person that was invested, after having saved $40,000 a year for 2 years, has less money than when they started. They've got $244,000 or so left. If we now extrapolate that out, so from 2008 or 2009 all the way to 2023, the person that's been saving cash along the way, they've done great. They've managed to have $1 million. They're now a millionaire almost 20 years later. But the person that stayed invested is almost $4 million. Okay, so when we talk about the amount of money, the difference here, it's not a small bit. Now, here's the challenge. 2 years in, you're dealing with pretty big losses. I mean, this person in our scenario has lost, what, $100,000?
Let's talk a little bit about the state of mind that investor was in. What was happening in 2009? I was a homeowner during that period, and it was brutal. You knew one out of every, I'd say, 5 people at least were unemployed. Many of which were in your family. So you're thinking, oh man, this is terrible. The media was talking about how this was going to devolve into the next Great Depression. Things were dire, man. It was bad. So to be in that state of mind and have your portfolio down $100,000, which you started at, what was it? 250. You had to have iron hands to not give in emotionally, and politically too. You know, remember the Hope and Change campaign, and you know, it came and went, and there wasn't a lot of change, and the hope kind of floated away. You know, so you know, but there were a lot of folks that were politically ostracized during that time frame. But that's always the case. You know, you've got, you know, what, 45% to 50% that vote one way and the other vote the other way. So imagine if you were like not a political fan of the administration at that time, and the economy was not doing great. Unemployment was terrible. The housing market was terrible, and your portfolio was terrible. And you went to your financial advisor and they said, "I'll just hang in there."
Yeah. I mean, yeah. This would have been, I mean, that's kind of the point that I'm making here, which is to hold on. I mean, to be a good investor, quote unquote, good investor over time, you need to be able to hang on to your investments. Like, you have to be able to, when things look miserable, and we'll talk about another scenario here in a second where it looks maybe even a little bit more dire, when you're not saving money and you're actually living off of the money. But yeah, you've got to be able to sit there and afford to hold it when you're down that kind of money. And that affordability, there's kind of two elements of that. There's the emotional side, because I don't know about you, but once clients watch their balance go down for a year, year and a half, 2 years, I mean, that gets fairly, you kind of defeated. Yeah. In that moment, there is a level of capitulation that you're kind of fighting, right? So there's the emotional side. You know, you could sell out because you don't want to invest anymore, or you could sell out because you need the money. like you said, 1 out of 5 people that you knew was unemployed or whatever the statistic was. That's why, I mean, this scenario is a little hyperbolic, almost intentionally, because the truth is you do need some cash to keep you from having to sell out if you have a job loss or you become disabled or there's an unexpected whatever it might be that comes up. But you also need investments. So your job or our job as advisors is to work with clients to understand how comfortable are they emotionally with this volatility and how situationally well prepared are they to take, to not only hang on because they say they know they shouldn't sell out, but to hang on because they can actually afford to hang on.
Well, because again, we're tied back into elections. And that's why I brought up in that 2009 scenario why someone might be, emotionally compromised from a political affiliation standpoint. None of this stuff matters. It doesn't, in the economic grand scheme, what matters, as you said earlier, is we are a nation of consumers. What matters is, are you going to continue to go to the store and buy? Are you going to continue to show up to a job and work? Are you going to continue to improve your quality of life? Is the incentive there to do that? I think everybody who wakes up in the morning, most normal people wake up and say, you know what, today is going to be a better day. Maybe they don't say that to themselves literally, but they go and they get their coffee in the morning, they make their breakfast, they make their day a little bit better than it was yesterday. We're all incentivized to do that. And, if the opposite were true, then yeah, I think a deflationary collapse could be upon us. But the way our fiscal incentives are aligned and our economic incentives are aligned, it promotes this inflationary type of situation. All the stock market is just a manifestation of that. We have the ability to invest in companies that profit from our consumer appetites, and they grow their earnings. And the odds of that reversing course over long periods of time would be contrary to human behavior, I think. So for you to bet against markets because of either we're in a downtrend economically speaking, which tend to be short term, or because of some form of election cycle that doesn't seem to be going the way that you personally prefer it, does not mean that we're going to all of a sudden change human behavior. Human behavior has been the same as it is today for, tens of thousands of years. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So back to your scenario that you were pointing out, what was the alternative for the one that was withdrawing from their portfolio? What did that look like?
Well, so I kind of took the reflection of that. So in scenario one, we had somebody that was starting with $250,000 a year, saving $40,000 a year. If they stayed invested they would have ended up with roughly $4 million. So now I'm taking the $4 million and we're going to start in 2007 with a $4 million balance. And we're going to start withdrawing $200,000 a year. So what I want to simulate here is somebody who's actually retired. The common objection that we get here is, well, I'm retired. I can't take the risk anymore.
I'm too old to invest in the stock market.
Exactly. And so this is this is a $4 million account. We're taking $200,000 a year out of the account, adjusted for inflation. So the $200,000 actually now, almost 20 years later, is almost $300,000 a year that's coming out. This feels, you can kind of wince as I say this, but imagine you retired in 2007. You had $4 million. You're fully invested. You trust the stock market. You've been invested over long periods of time. You start living out of your money. And 2 years later, in 2009, you now have, instead of $4 million, you have $1.6 million. Okay. And we're always comparing this to what if you hadn't been invested. So for some comparison, had you been living out of this $4 million and not been invested, you'd still have $3.4 million left. So instead of having 3.4 million, you have 1.6 million. And as you mentioned, think about what was going on at that time. You're talking about the collapse of the banking system.
Yeah.
real estate. I mean, this was messy. The guts that it took.
The Dow fell 10% in one day.
Yeah. And the guts that it takes to stay invested as a retiree and live $200,000 a year out of now your $1.6 million portfolio, which, by the way, doesn't sound healthy from the advisor's perspective. I mean, $200,000 a year coming out of a $1.6 million portfolio is a lot of money.
Yeah.
It took basically, I don't know, to get your $4 million back. It took until 2017.
Yeah.
But you eventually did do it. Had you not been invested.
And that's with the withdrawals, by the way.
And that's with the withdrawals, right? So you would have, your balance would have crossed back above $4 million almost 10 years later after having withdrawn $2 million.
Yeah.
And fast forward to the end of 2023, you would have about $5.5 million left in the portfolio compared to had you not been invested, you would have ran out a year and a half ago. So again, and this span I picked on purpose for a couple of reasons. One, you were heading into the biggest financial crisis of anybody living's right now's life. Right. This was a year before the 2008, 2009 crisis where I chose as a starting point. You also span 1, 2, 3, 4 different presidents, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. You span 1, 2, 3, 4 20% plus drawdowns in the stock market. You have geopolitical problems, wars in the Middle East, collapse of countries in Europe, the Greek crisis. You had Puerto Rico default on their debt in here. You had North Korea shooting nukes at people. You had Russia invade Ukraine. You had a global pandemic. I know those two are
When
out
did
of
North
order.
Korea shoot a nuke?
Oh, 2018. You don't remember the news and Kim Jong-un was shooting nukes into the middle of the ocean. And I mean, the whole world was on edge thinking that this guy might.
I didn't know he activated nukes. Like he actually had nuclear weapons tests like that.
Yeah,
man, I missed that. Gee whiz.
You go fact check me, but but the point is there's a lot of ugly stuff.
Yeah. Well, like, you had the global spanning panic. That was 2020.
You have this span when we actually break it down to go from 2007 to 2023 in markets, the amount of slop that you have to trudge through between geopolitical issues, political issues, economic issues. It's a lot. And the market still managed to
innovate,
grind higher,
to grow. Think about the technological innovations we've had over that period of time. You know, people forget about that. We are all we're all victims of the recency bias. You know what that is? You know, you tend to think of that what's going on today is just the way it's always been, or the way it's always been. Like we've always had these, like this whole setup we have, this whole podcast setup. I mean, this thing didn't exist back in 2000. Well, it did. I mean, you could do a podcast, but we didn't have all this equipment. We, Podbeam wasn't in there. We didn't have this Mo2 adapter and all this technology we're surrounded by, from the laptops to the. I mean, do you remember the laptop that you had in 2008, 9? I remember mine. It was awful. I didn't even have an iPhone. The iPhone was launched in 2007.
Do you remember how you got the choice to choose the cursor that would show up when your computer was just waiting?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so your computer would had to take so much time to process things that you'd open the internet and your mouse would go from a mouse to an hourglass.
So I got another story. So we always talk about technology, but a very close friend of mine had a stroke. And she passed out in her bathroom with a stroke. Her friend saw her and rushed her. They called the ambulance. They rushed her to a hospital. Hospital literally gave her a medication. This thing has just been formulated, just been invented and patented, where it broke down. They gave her this medication. It broke down the clot in her brain and her brain immediately recovered. So far, knock on wood, no negative consequences from the stroke. These are the kinds of innovations that are happening now, and these things are continuing to happen today.
Right.
You know, and they're not stopping.
Innovation doesn't slow down for the president.
Well, let's talk about this, because let's tie this into the debt conversation, because I get a lot of comments on debt, and to be honest, it concerns me too. You know, the U.S. Treasury is scheduled to auction off $8.9 trillion this year in new debt, you know, which is roughly 26% of the total outstanding debt. And I have to say this number out loud because it's ridiculously long. The total outstanding debt, according to the U.S. Department of Treasury, is $34,155,000,629,668.67. A lot of money. All right. But at the same time, you know, our economy is growing by, 23 billion. So right now we are a little hot on the debt. We're about 118% debt to GDP. And our interest expenses, this is the interest the government pays on debt, is, if you think your mortgage interest is bad, listen to this. 882 billion a year is how much in interest our government is paying. I think it officially surpassed defense spending as a net interest expense line item on the U.S. Cash outflow statement. But so, that's about 3.7% of GDP, which is historically high. It is a big concern. Right now, we don't have enough tax revenue to cover the deficit. I think tax revenue right now, which is at an all-time high, coincidentally, is $4.44 trillion. So, it isn't sufficient to cover all of the U.S. expenses, because we obviously are deficit spending. But it is not as dire as everyone makes it out to be. I am constantly reading, again, on financial Twitter, just prognostications that the dollar is going to fail, and it's just a matter of time, and we're going to hyperinflate, and we're all going to be on a Bitcoin standard, and Bitcoin's going to the moon, and so is gold, and all these other alternatives. All right. Now, these things may happen in the future. I can't predict it, but right now, I don't see it happening. The US dollar is incredibly robust. It is very strong. There's no competitor that I can see. None. To compare.
Well, people don't really understand the extent of the plumbing in world trade that is built around the dollar.
Exactly.
And I'm not saying that can't change, but the enormity of the task of changing that and getting the whole world operating a different way, it would take a lot of time.
Well, I think people tend to think that our time that we live in is more interesting than it really is. And as such, they convince themselves that these catastrophic delineating points in history will happen in their lifetimes. Like the dollar is going to collapse while I'm alive. It would be one of those. All right, maybe it does. Probably not. I think what will happen over time is eventually the dollar as a fiat currency will fail, just like the Roman currency, whatever that was.
Yeah, Rome was around for about 1,000 years. So if you lived for 60, what was your likelihood of being around when they failed?
Very small. So, and I think the same is true today. And we get caught up in these moments. I know people, not personally, but there are people that put all their money into gold, or they put all their money into Bitcoin or something like that because they just think this is imminent. And it could be, maybe they're right, but it's a gamble. It is a speculation. So the US dollar is still very strong. It is, the day I see someone walk over $100 bill laying on the floor is the day I'm like, uh-oh, we're in trouble. We're nowhere close to that. Nowhere close. So anyway, I don't think the dollar is heading for collapse, but the U.S. fiscal situation is somewhat concerning because of two reasons. One is I believe that deficit spending accelerates the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I also think as such, because of that, it diverts inflation into financial assets, which the haves are the ones that tend to.
Meaning the things that inflate are not the toothpaste at the grocery store. It's the house. It's the second home.
It's the stock.
It's the financial assets.
If you look at P ratios over the past 20 years, they've been inflating, not because companies have been earning. Well, obviously, because the P ratios have been going up. So the stock market valuation, what's considered fair valuation, has been going higher and higher and higher. Used to be the average was around 15. Now the S&P 500 P ratio is around, it's a little over 20. And people say, well, it's historically overvalued. It's like, well, those value, what's considered fair valuation has been growing a little bit more because you just see a stronger appetite for stocks. And it's because you were concentrating more wealth into that top quintile.
When somebody that has $1 billion gets an extra $1 million,
they're going to be more likely to put it in the stock market than they are to spend it at the grocery store.
Versus if you gave somebody that doesn't have any money, $1 million.
So this deficit spending is concerning for that reason, where you are seeing an acceleration of the separation between the middle class, the lower class, and upper class. But it also does manifest itself through higher inflation. So I think there is an upper limit as to how much debt the U.S. can actually accumulate before it materially weakens the currency and encourages a flight to an alternative. I think we're pretty far away from that. I don't know what that limit is. It's theoretical. Nobody knows. So I think it will happen slowly over time, though, and then there will be a sudden point at the future. Who knows when? Could be 1,000 years from now. But that is on the minds of voters right now, and I don't think that really it's going to make a difference in this election. I think the U.S. fiscal situation is not going to be.
It's not a big enough problem yet.
But for this, except with one exception, we'll close on this, and that is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. All right, so that is a big cliffhanger. The last year.
So let me set the stage a little bit for the listener.
Yes. Do that.
Okay. So when Trump became president, he made sweeping changes to the tax system. And when those changes were proposed, basically what happens is some actuaries do some math to say, here's what we think this tax change is going to cost. And the tax changes, the way that they were proposed, had no expiration date. They were changes that were made on a permanent basis. And they did. There's two arguments to this. There's an expense to taxes, but then, of course, the other argument is, well, if it increases economic activity, then there could be some offset. But regardless, the way that the projections were done, there was expense to the change. And so if you made the change permanent forever and ever, it was very expensive. And what this meant was that when it came to passing this bill through Congress, Trump needed more Democratic support. And he knew he wasn't going to get that support. So the way to fix this was that if you made the tax bill budget neutral, you didn't have to get the same level.
You could pass it through reconciliation.
You could pass it through reconciliation. Mm-hmm. So basically the way to fix this was they just said, okay, we're going to make the tax changes, but we're going to say that in 2026, they expire. We just revert to the old tax code. Mm-hmm. So things that changed, we have lower tax brackets. We have bigger standard deductions. We have a qualified business income deduction for business owners.
My personal favorite is the doubling of the child tax credit.
So there's all of these things. Now, this didn't impact people equally. One thing that was really different is there was a cap to how much of your state and local taxes could be deducted. Mm-hmm. So it used to be if you lived in New York and you paid $100,000 of state taxes plus property taxes and so on, you could deduct all of that against your federal taxes. Trump's tax cuts came in and said, no, you're capped at a $10,000 deduction for this. So that was the biggest. Maybe that really did change the tax situation for somebody in like a New York or California versus somebody in a Tennessee in terms of like the amount of state and local taxes they're paying. But the bottom line is whoever wins this presidential election is going to be the presiding president during the sunset of the tax cuts and jobs act.
Which is a big deal. And I think if that president is the current administration, it seems not completely unlikely, but rather unlikely that most of the tax cuts would get extended. It's not sensible to pontificate on that and try to predict the politics of this. The correct assumption is,
if Trump is in office, do you think he's going to want to get rid of his own cuts?
He won't. But I think if he does, which is I think unlikely unless we have some sort of recession this year, which doesn't seem to be the case. In the unlikely event that he does assume office, I don't think he's going to have a Republican Senate and House. It'll probably continue to be mixed. Then again, these are pointless predictions because we don't know. We just don't know what the makeup of our government's going to look like in November. I think the sensible thing to presume is that these tax cuts will expire. And if they do expire, I did the math on this based on, IRS return data that came out. It's going to equal approximately $330 billion in additional taxes on the average taxpayer. And that is primarily middle class, not upper income earners. So this is money that's going to be, most of it is going to be pulled directly out of Main Street and directly out of the economy. That is enough to trigger a recession. That equates to about a 1.2% reduction in GDP. Now you think, well, that's not enough to trigger a recession on its own. Yes, but you could easily see that cause contagion. All right, so you now have $500 less per month to spend. So not only do you cut back on $500, but you're probably less likely to buy a new home. You're less likely to buy a new car. You're less likely to change jobs. You're going to see an economic grind down for at least a year to give consumers a chance to reset their cash flow statements and their budgets. So I think that the next year to look out for recession is going to be 2026 based on what happens in this election. So yes, you should consider elections when it comes to your portfolio, but long term, when I'm talking long term, like 10 years plus, I don't think it matters all that much because let's say you just bought the S&P and you ignored everything I just said. And you just said, okay, recession's coming in 2026 and you did nothing from point to point, you'd probably be better off than if you tried to, time things. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I think, again, our job as financial planners isn't to lick our finger, stick it in the wind and say, hey, Mr. Client, hope I'm right, because if I'm right, your retirement works. But if I'm wrong, it doesn't. Our job really revolves around admitting that you don't know what you don't know. And you certainly don't know the future. It's a very squishy, one of the hardest things. And when I'm teaching my class, you can see this because there are some students that are very mathematically oriented and they want to do analysis. They want to have a definitive answer. But the fact is, when it comes to financial planning, you are working with something that is unknowable, and that's the future. And so there's really not an easy way to get to, if any way to get to a definitive answer on certain things. So really, it is one of it, with a lot of professions, there are right and wrong ways for things to be done. In our profession, it is a little tricky because you don't know the future. So you always have to be expecting the unexpected. And you have to build a portfolio that's able to support a base case and also support a number of other scenarios. Yeah,
you have to pick a sensible allocation and then stick with it. And then you have to engage in what I call benign negligence, benign portfolio negligence.
What do we say? The best investment is the one that you can hang on to.
Yep. And be optimistic. We are wired to think negatively about the future because we're just, we're like animals scanning the trees for lions. We're looking for the next threat that's going to end our existence. But that's just, the reality is that there's a lot more fruit out there than there are predators. Since 2008, for example, we've got cloud computing, tablets, fitness trackers, 3D printing, social media, which I argue might be a de-evolution. We got large language models, gene editing. There are so many innovations. And to think like, oh, this is all going to grind to a halt, I think is just not, there's no evidence that is true. So I appreciate everyone listening to Brent and I ramble on and on about this stuff. And we hope that you go into this election season and escape it with your sanity and intact portfolios. Brent, where can the listeners find more about you?
So my website is www.infinitewealthplanning.com. You can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook as well. So anyway, thanks for the conversation.
Yes, and I'm Ben Jones, National Wealth Management Group. You can find more about me on Twitter. It's or x.com now, at the Carrot Stick. Carrots, K-A-R-A-T stick. Thank you for listening. Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Advisory services offered through National Wealth Management Group, LLC, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial, LLC. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. Economic forecasts set forth may not develop as predicted, and there can be no guarantee that strategies promoted will be successful. This information is not intended as authoritative guidance or tax or legal advice. You should consult with your attorney or tax advisor for guidance on your specific situation. Brent Gargano is not affiliated with LPL Financial.